Never thought 23 years of building a life with someone could unravel in the 40 seconds it took me to walk from the kitchen to my own bedroom door. My wife had a man in our bed. She looked at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. She said, "I've been wanting to tell you, this is happening now. If you can't handle it, there's the door." 3 days later, I got a call that changed everything. She was gone. Not the way you're thinking, but gone in a way I never expected. My name is Roland Voss. I'm 51 years old. For the past 18 years, I've built custom furniture, not the mass-produced kind you assemble with an Allen wrench, but handmade pieces that people pass down to their grandchildren. My workshop is behind our house in Asheville, North Carolina, and there was a period in my life when the smell of raw walnut and sawdust felt like the most honest thing in the world. I had 3 apprentices, a waiting list 14 months long, and a feature in Architectural Digest that brought more work than I could ever take on alone. I met my wife at a lumberyard in Black Mountain. She was arguing with the supplier over a miscut order white oak for a kitchen renovation she was managing. She had a pencil behind her ear, sawdust on her sleeve, and the kind of confidence that made everyone in the building slightly nervous. I asked her if she needed a witness. She laughed and said she needed a better supplier. We were married 14 months later. We had a son together. Our boy was 20 when all of this happened. He was in his junior year at NC State studying civil engineering, all practical sense and quiet ambition, the kind of kid who texts you on random Tuesdays just to check in. My wife also had a daughter from her first marriage, 4 years older than our son, a landscape architect living in Denver. I'd been in that girl's life since she was 13. I drove her to prom, helped her move into 3 different apartments, walked her down the aisle when she married her husband 2 years ago. That's who we were. That was the ground I thought I was standing on. I'd spent 4 weeks in Vermont that fall working on a commission, a full dining set for a restored farmhouse near Stowe. Maple and hand-forged iron hardware, 8 chairs, a table that seated 12. It was the kind of job that demanded your complete attention, which meant I was sleeping in a rented room above a hardware store and calling home every few nights. My wife seemed fine, busy with a commercial project downtown. She mentioned she'd been spending time with a friend from her interior design network, someone new she'd met at a conference in Charlotte. She described him as refreshing. I didn't think anything of it. I drove home on a Thursday instead of the Sunday I told her. One of the chairs had cracked at the joint during finishing. Bad tension in the wood I should have caught earlier, and I needed to start the replacement immediately or miss the client's deadline. I pulled into our driveway at 9:30 in the evening. There was an unfamiliar car parked against the fence. Dark gray BMW, out-of-state plates. Inside, the house was quiet. Low lights, a half-empty bottle of wine on the kitchen counter. I set my bag down and walked the hallway toward the back bedroom, thinking maybe my wife had a colleague visiting and they'd gone to sleep early. The door was partially open. I pushed it. She was sitting up against the headboard. A man I'd never seen before was beside her, his arm around her shoulder with the easy comfort of someone very familiar with that space. My wife said my name. She didn't sound alarmed. She sounded inconvenienced. I stood in the doorway and looked at the man. He was maybe 40, well-dressed even now. The kind of person whose casual clothes still looked pressed. He didn't try to hide. He looked right back at me. "You want to tell me what's happening in my bedroom?" I said. My wife set down her wine glass. "Roland, I've been trying to find the right time to have this conversation." "You found it," I said. She sat up straighter. She told me his name. I'll call him what he was, the intruder. She told me they'd been seeing each other for 8 months. She said she hadn't planned it, but she'd realized their marriage had become more of a business arrangement than a partnership, and she wasn't willing to live that way anymore. She said she wanted an open arrangement and that she'd already spoken to a therapist without me who had encouraged her to honor her needs. "I want you to be part of this conversation," she said. "But this relationship is real and it isn't ending." The intruder said something then. He said, "Nobody's trying to push you out, man. There's a way to do this where everyone gets what they need." I looked at him for a moment. I told him to leave my house. He didn't move. He looked at my wife. She said, "He has a right to be here." "Not in my house," I said. "Our house," she replied. That's when I heard the creak of the hallway floor. My son appeared behind me. He'd come home for the weekend without telling us, the way college kids do. He was still wearing his jacket. He'd heard enough. His face had gone completely still in the way it does when he's trying to process something that doesn't make sense. "Dad," he said quietly. My wife looked at him. She said, "Sweetheart, this is a conversation between adults. Go to your room." He didn't move. He said, "That's not Mom's room. That's not how this works." She told him he didn't understand the full picture. She told him he needed to trust her. He said, with a calmness I still haven't recovered from, "I understand exactly what I'm looking at." The intruder finally stood up. He picked up his jacket from the chair by the window, her reading chair, the one I built for her 5th anniversary, and said something about reaching out tomorrow to continue the dialogue. Then he walked past me in the hallway like he was leaving a meeting that had run long. My wife sat on the bed and told me I was overreacting. She told me I was never present, always in the workshop or on a job, and she'd felt alone for years. She said she'd tried to tell me, and I hadn't listened. Maybe that was partly true. I don't know. What I know is that 8 months is not a conversation. 8 months is a decision. I went to the hall closet and pulled out my camping pack. I walked through the house picking up things. My laptop, my hard drives with 15 years of design files, a photograph from the shelf in the living room, the one from my son's first day of high school. My wife followed me and talked the whole time. Her voice kept cycling between anger and something that sounded almost like pleading. I didn't respond. There was nothing left in me for words. My son met me at the front door. He asked where I was going. I told him I had a friend with a cabin up near Brevard. I'd be there. I call him. He said, "I'll come this weekend." I nodded. Then I got in my truck and drove north into the dark. The cabin belonged to a college friend of mine who turned it into a weekend rental, but he kept it open for me whenever I needed it. It sat on a ridge above a creek you could hear all night through the walls. I've been going there for years when a commission went sideways or I needed to think through a design problem. I built the bunk beds and the back bedroom. I knew every board in that place. I got there around midnight, built a fire, and sat in the dark with a glass of bourbon I didn't taste. My phone had 12 missed calls by morning. I listened to none of them. I texted my son the address and nothing else. For 2 days I worked with my hands. I'd brought a commission project with me. Small stuff. A set of jewelry boxes for a client in Charleston. And I shaped wood for hours at a time because it was the only activity that made my brain quiet. I hiked the creek trail at dawn. I ate badly. I slept a lot and woke up feeling worse than before I'd slept. On the 3rd morning, I heard gravel on the driveway. My son's truck. He was alone. He had a grocery bag in each arm and the expression of a man twice his age. He set the bags down on the kitchen table. Coffee, real food, a 6-pack of the amber ale I like, and looked at me for a moment. "You look like a before photo," he said. I laughed in spite of everything. That's his way. He got it from me. We sat on the porch, and he told me what had been happening since I left. My wife had been calling everyone she knew, including a sister in Denver, including my business partner, including, apparently, my elderly mother. She told varying versions of the same story. That I'd abandoned her during an emotional crisis. That I'd refused to listen. That I'd reacted with controlling behavior. The intruder had been at the house every day. My son said, "There's something else." He showed me his phone, a local news alert. My wife had been found unconscious in our home the previous evening by a neighbor who'd come to check on her after she'd stopped responding to texts. She was at Mission Hospital. Alcohol and a combination of medications. The neighbor had called 911. Condition was listed as serious. I read the alert twice. "She's going to be okay," my son said, watching me. "The hospital called me last night. She's stable now. I didn't want to come up here and tell you over the phone." I set the phone down on the porch railing. "They need someone to authorize decisions in case her condition changes," he said. "You're still her husband." That was the word that cut through everything else. Still. Whatever had happened in that bedroom, whatever she'd decided, and whoever she'd invited into our life, I had signed papers. I had made promises. And despite what she'd done, I am not the kind of man who disappears when there is a decision that needs to be made. I told my son to get his jacket. We drove to Asheville. The hospital parking lot had 2 news vans. That confused me until my son explained that the intruder had given an interview that morning to a local reporter, identifying himself as her partner and describing me as an absent, emotionally unavailable husband who had abandoned her in a vulnerable moment. He'd been crying in the clip. My son had watched 30 seconds of it before turning it off. We walked into the main entrance. The intruder was in the waiting area on the 3rd floor, sitting with a group of women I recognized as my wife's book club friends, holding court like a grieving husband. When he saw me, something behind his eyes recalibrated. He stood up. He said I had some nerve showing up now. My son stepped in front of me, not aggressively, just placed himself there and said, very quietly, "My father is her legal husband. I'd sit back down if I were you." I went to the nurse's station. I identified myself. There was initial confusion. The intruder had spent 2 days presenting himself as her primary support person, but my son had brought my wife's insurance card and our marriage certificate from the file box he'd grabbed from home. The nurse reviewed everything and led me to her room without further discussion. My wife looked small. That's the first thing I noticed. She always had a physical presence in a room, the kind of person who took up space intentionally, who moved like the space belonged to her. In the hospital bed with the monitors and the IV line, and her hair loose and flat against the pillow, she looked like someone I hadn't seen in a very long time. I sat in the chair beside her bed. She was unconscious. I sat there for nearly 2 hours before she stirred. When she opened her eyes and saw me, she turned her face away. Then she turned back. "Why are you here?" she asked. Her voice was rough. "You're still my wife," I said. Same answer I'd given my son. She closed her eyes again. She said, "I didn't think you'd come." I didn't respond to that. The doctor came in, a quiet man with reading glasses around his neck, and explained that she'd mixed anti-anxiety medication with wine, significantly more of each than was advisable. They'd found no note and no indication of specific intent. His clinical read was that she'd been in significant emotional distress and had made poor decisions about managing it. They wanted a psychological evaluation before discharge. After he left, my wife and I sat in silence for several minutes. Then she said, "He's been different since you left." I looked at her. "Colder," she said, "immediately. Like he'd been waiting for you to be gone." She paused. "He started asking me things about the business accounts, about the property. He wanted to know whether the workshop was in both our names." A very specific kind of cold moved through me. "He said we should talk to a financial planner," she continued. "His financial planner. He wanted me to sign something." She laughed, a dry, defeated sound. "I told him I wasn't signing anything while I was in the state. That's when things got strange." "How strange?" He left. Came back an hour later with wine. He'd never brought wine to the house before. He opened it in the kitchen and brought me a glass. We talked. Then I don't remember anything until the paramedics. I was very still. "I'm not saying he did something," she said. "I'm saying I don't know." But I was already thinking about the things she'd told me in the previous days. 8 months. A man who appeared from a conference in Charlotte. A therapist she'd seen without me. Steps in a sequence that suddenly looked less like spontaneous feeling and more like a planned approach. I found Detective Renfield in the hallway when I stepped out to find my son. He was a plainclothes officer with the county, assigned to follow up on suspected overdose cases. He'd already spoken to my son. He wanted to speak to me. He explained that a review of my wife's medical intake had flagged some irregularities. The combination and volume of medication in her system didn't align with her prescription dosages. There were questions. He was being careful with his language, but the questions were specific. Had anyone else been in the home that evening? Did she have a history of mixing substances? Was there anyone who might have had access to her medications? I told him about the intruder. I told him about the conversation I just had with my wife. He wrote everything down. He says they were looking into it. The next morning, my wife's daughter, my daughter in every way that mattered, arrived from Denver. She drove straight through the night. She hugged me for a long time in the hallway without saying anything. Then she went in to sit with her mother. That afternoon, she came and found me in the hospital cafeteria. She sat across from me and wrapped both hands around a paper cup of bad coffee and said, "I need to tell you something I should have told you months ago." She had met the intruder at Easter when she'd visited without me. I'd been on a deadline. She said something about him had struck her as wrong immediately, but she hadn't been able to name it, and her mother had been so animated, so certain, that she'd let it go. Then, 3 weeks ago, out of a vague worry she couldn't shake, she'd run his name through some professional databases she had access to through her firm. She'd found 2 civil cases in Georgia and a pattern of complaints with financial regulatory boards, all involving women, all involving allegations of misrepresentation and unauthorized access to accounts. "I found it, and I didn't know what to do with it," she said. "I was afraid of what it would mean for her, for you, For all of us. So I waited. I kept thinking it would resolve. She looked at her coffee. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have said something immediately." I told her she had nothing to apologize for. I meant it. Detective Renfield moved quickly once my wife gave her full statement. Blood tests confirmed elevated levels of a sedative, not prescribed to my wife, consistent with something added to a drink. Security footage from a pharmacy 2 blocks from our house showed the intruder purchasing the medication 4 days before the hospitalization. His phone records showed he made 2 calls to a number connected to a property management firm the morning after I'd left the house. He was arrested at a hotel in Charlotte 3 days later. The charges were serious: criminal poisoning, financial fraud, and additional counts from cases in 2 other states that had been pending for years. My wife called me from her hospital room the morning after the arrest. Her voice was steadier. "They told me what they found," she said. "In my blood. In his records." I waited. "I was a fool," she said. "You were targeted," I said. "There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to be generous right now." "I'm not being generous. I'm being accurate." She was released from the hospital 4 days after she was admitted. My son drove her home. She asked me once, carefully, whether I was coming back. I told her I didn't know yet. That was the honest answer. The following weeks moved in their own strange rhythm. The story broke widely once the arrests became public. Regional news, then national. Once reporters connected the cases across state lines. There were articles, requests for comment. A producer from a true crime podcast who left 3 voicemails. I ignored all of it. My daughter wrote 1 brief public statement through the hospital's communications office, identifying our family, confirming my wife was recovering, and requesting privacy. That was enough. I spent those weeks between the cabin and Asheville. I reopened the workshop and went back to the jewelry boxes, which had been sitting unfinished, and I found that working with my hands was still the most reliable way I knew to sort through what I was feeling. My wife and I spoke by phone, then in person, then more regularly over the following month. We talked about things we hadn't talked about in years. We talked about the ways I had retreated into work and what that had taken from her. We talked about what she'd been feeling long before the intruder appeared and why she hadn't come to me with it. There were no easy answers. There were moments when the conversation was almost unbearable, and moments when something clicked back into place between us that I'd thought was broken forever. We didn't make any decisions quickly. That was deliberate. Some things need time before they become clear. What I can tell you is that I understood, sitting with all of it, that our marriage had been cracking for a long time in ways neither of us had been honest about. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it made the full picture something I could look at without needing to simplify it into a story about a villain and a victim. The intruder pleaded guilty to 4 felony counts 6 months after his arrest. He'll be in federal prison until he is an old man. The other women he'd targeted received some financial restitution from assets seized at arrest. My wife testified. She sat in that room and said everything clearly and did not look away from the process. I watched her do that and thought, there she is, the woman I married, still in there under everything that had happened. My son graduated the following spring. We were all there. My wife, my daughter, and her husband, me. We ate dinner afterward at a restaurant downtown, and it was easier than I expected it to be, and harder in some ways than I was prepared for, because sitting at that table, I could see all the versions of our family at once. What we had been, what we had bones, what we were still becoming. I've learned, in the time since, that some damage teaches you what you actually value. The workshop is still behind the house. The waiting list is back. I built my wife a new reading chair last winter, different wood than the first one, darker, more weight to it. She cried when I brought it inside. I didn't have a speech ready. I just said, I thought the other one needed replacing. Some things you can't rebuild from the original design. You have to start from the raw material and trust your hands to know what the shape should be. I think about the reading chair a lot. Not the first one, the one I built early in our marriage from pale ash, the one that ended up in our bedroom, the one that was sitting right there when I walked in that night and saw everything I thought I knew collapse. I think about the second one, the darker wood, the extra weight in the frame I put there on purpose, because I wanted it to last longer than the first. There's a version of the story where I walk away clean and never look back, and I understand why some people think that's the right ending. I've read the comments on stories like mine. I know what people say, but I also know that living through something is different from watching it happen to someone else, and the feelings don't sort themselves into clean categories the way we want them to. What I've come to understand slowly, the way wood dries, the way you can't rush it, is that the choices that held through this whole thing weren't the dramatic ones. They weren't the moment I walked out or the moment I drove back. The choices that mattered were smaller and older. The decision my son made at 20 years old to step between me and the intruder without flinching, calmly, without a single wasted word. The decision my daughter made to drive through the night from Denver and then sit across from me in a hostel cafeteria and tell me the truth about what she'd found, even though she was afraid of what it would cost. Those weren't impulse decisions. Those were the result of who those two people had built themselves into, quietly, over years. That's not luck. That's character, accumulated. I spent a long time after everything settled, trying to understand how my wife had been taken in so completely. She is not a naive person. She is sharp and decisive, and she built a career on reading spaces and people accurately. But the intruder had been precise about exactly where she was vulnerable. The loneliness she'd been carrying without telling me, the feeling of being left behind in a life I was passionate about. He found the crack and he worked it. That's what people like him do. And the honest thing I have to sit with is that the crack existed in part because I hadn't been paying attention. I'd confused providing with being present. Those are not the same thing. What I know now is that resilience isn't the absence of damage. It's what you build after you've taken the full count of what broke. My son had it. My daughter had it. My wife found it again, somewhere on the far side of the worst thing she'd ever done to herself and to us. I had to find it in the only place I'd ever known how to look. With my hands, in the workshop, in the smell of raw wood and the weight of a tool that does what you ask of it when you treat it right. The intruder calculated everything. He miscalculated one thing, that the people around me were the kind who stay. He built his whole scheme on the assumption that crisis scatters people. In our case, it didn't. I'm not sure I have a tidy summary of what all of this means, but I know that the chair I built the second time is better than the first one, and I know why.